Thanks for being here today. We're super excited to be here with y'all. My name's Alana.
I'm Jessie.
And we are together, the co-founders of makingmensches. We started our organization during COVID. This is our first in-person doing something, which is really cool. So super excited to have that be in this space with you all. Makingmensches started out of wanting white Jewish spaces to be more welcoming and self-aware and open to Black Jews and Jews of color. And I think it's very much shifted to being a radical Jewish community and building a different version of Judaism that feels good for us and aligns with our values. Do you have anything to add to who we are?
We've definitely expanded to meet the needs of the people we've been working with, because people have said, yes, we need to talk about this, but I also want to talk about how I've been isolated in Jewish spaces and what kind of gaps there are in our communities. So it's been really cool to interact with different communities and see what the needs are and where we've missed the mark, so to speak, in our Jewish communities.
Yeah, so that's who we are. And today we just wanted to talk about Rosh Chodesh with you all and a really brief overview on Jewish mysticism and how that connects to the divine feminine. So just lots of really good, fun topics, and we're super excited to share them with you.
This is definitely something we've been really excited to talk about for so long. So I'm really glad you're here for it.
We wanted to start with just a brief overview of what is Jewish mysticism and what is Kabbalah. So Kabbalah translates or can be translated to mysticism or occult knowledge. So it's just very directly the Jewish form of mysticism. And it's grounded in the Zohar, which is a text that interprets the Torah in a more mystic sense. And so that's the text that underpins all of Kabbalah. Something that I think is really, just a really cool and valuable part of Kabbalah is the fact that practitioners identify the creator and creation as a continuum, and all beings having a part of that creator and creation in themselves. So it's this very intimate connection to a divine being or divine entity, and the idea that there's not just one entity, but a continuum of this energy. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add to the Zohar. Kabbalah often has an oral tradition that's associated with it. The Zohar is the text that grounds it, because when it was circulated in medieval Spain, pretty much, it was in Aramaic and Hebrew, and the translation is not really direct. So what's really cool about the Zohar is it makes up words sometimes, it combines words. It's its really unique own text that leads to a lot of different interpretation, and which makes it so interesting for Kabbalah to play with the different definitions that come out when different people interpret the Zohar. Oh, yes. And what we have as an image behind us are the Sefirot, the 10 different components, really, that are the backbone of Kabbalah. What we found really cool, we could go through all 10, but I was listening to a rabbi say that if we spent 50 hours talking about one, we'd still be scratching the surface, so I'm not going to spend 50 hours talking about it. But there are different components that are not to be equated with God, but kind of parallel to and involved in the creation, like Alana was saying. Down the middle, there are opposites on either side. So one is loving kindness and giving and being the loving, kind person that we are, and on another side is gevura, which is rejection, sometimes translated as strength or kind of the opposite of chesed. And that's just an example. You can't always be all giving and all loving. We have to honor the part of ourselves and the part of creation that is rejection. We have to say no sometimes. So if we're always giving, we're not honoring the part of ourselves that needs to say no and protect ourselves. That's just one example of how the Sefirot can function in our identity, the larger energy of the world.
Thanks, Jessie. Yeah, so just a very quick overview of Jewish mysticism. There's so much to get into with Kabbalah, and neither myself nor Jessie are experts, which is why we're not claiming to be. We're just giving an overview and moving into Rosh Chodesh. But the ties to the holiday of Rosh Chodesh are strong just because Rosh Chodesh centers the divine feminine, which is a very key component of Kabbalah, and the idea of the divine feminine and divine masculine are they come up a lot in discussions around Kabbalah. So we wanted to start with like a quick, we've already began, but we want to center our practice on like a quick tarot grounding. I think one of the really cool things for me about Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism is its ties to other spiritual practices and of understanding how all of these different forms of magic and spiritual practice really flow together. And so the practice of reading tarot is very connected to Kabbalah. You'll see in this slide, we have the Sephirot, and then this, which is also translated to mean the tree of life. And so that can also be connected to the reading of tarot. Again, we don't have time today to go into what is tarot and what is the major arcana, but there are connections between each of these branches in the tree of life and the different paths that the major arcana cards take. So we're gonna situate in a quick little tarot reading that I'll do for y'all and us in this space. So the card that I drew is the Ace of Discs. I'm just going to give a brief overview of what that might feel like for our space. The Ace of Discs is very much a card of opportunity and potential for abundance and also connecting spirit to matter. So I don't know, I think that's really cool and powerful for our space specifically, where we're really talking about these connections between our earthbound bodies and our spirituality, and also just the general abundance that I think sharing spirituality and connecting different forms of spirituality can bring. So I think that's a really good place to ground the rest of our conversation and time together. So, what is Rosh Chodesh? Do you want to start us off, Jesse?
Yeah, I can start off Rosh Chodesh in a pretty traditional interpretation within Judaism. The holiday itself is grounded in the Torah several times, but specifically it is often mentioned alongside Shabbat. Rosh Chodesh honors the new moon of every Jewish month. The Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. Didn't start off that way because the moon changes and it took a while to get down to the format of a calendar. There's still some Jews who only follow the moon phases, so they're out of sync with the rest of the Jewish calendar, but very cool tradition. We're not following the traditional calendars in Western spaces. So one component of this is that every new moon, you're not supposed to work, you're supposed to go and to whatever religious space is good for you. And specifically, there's always been a component that women specifically rest, and people who identify as women don't work on that day. Where this comes from is its interpretation. There's a midrash where Rabbi Eliezer says that the reason for the holiday is that when the golden calf was being constructed, right, Moses is up getting the Torah, and the men go around and they say, okay, we need all the women's jewelry, we need all the jewelry, we're gonna melt it down, and we're going to make a golden calf to worship because we don't believe God is coming for us. Supposedly, according to the Midrash, the women refused. And they said, no, this is not right, you're betraying God, this is an act of horribleness, right? They refused. And so, therefore, in this Midrash, God rewarded them with a holiday. And to contrast, once there was a Mishkan in the desert and once they were building it, the women all rushed to give their jewelry because they recognized that this was like a lawful, good practice of God. And so some people are like, yes, women not giving up our jewelry, but it's a lot deeper than that. It's not just women refusing to give up earrings. It's, for me, what I've been putting together, and honestly, like I've heard this a million times, is this Jewish tradition of denial and refusal, because often we get the best stories that come out of refusal to do something, whether it's Ruth and Naomi, whether it's Jonah running from God, whether it's Moses saying, I can't really do this, I need help. It's this tradition of when we refuse, maybe we're honoring the gevura, honoring our strength and our rejection, and we get these really cool traditions and holidays.
Thanks, Jesse.
Yeah.
I love every time Jessie talks about Jewish history stuff because she's so wise. I'm always just in awe. Yeah, so I think that historical Torah-based grounding of Rosh Chodesh is really powerful, and I think something we don't talk about. It's not one of these major Jewish holidays that we talk about. As a Jewish person growing up, we focus a lot on like Passover and the high holidays, which is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But then there are all of these really, magical holidays that we have as part of our tradition, and something that I think really stood out to me was the idea that Rosh Chodesh was really one of the first Jewish practices, because one of the first commandments, if we're going by the Torah, that God gives is to acknowledge the new moon and celebrate the new moon. And so Rosh Chodesh is, at its core, a celebration of the new moon. Like Jesse said, it's historically in Jewish tradition been very focused on its celebration by women identifying people. And it also corresponds with so many other magic and spiritual practices, which again really ties into this overlapping between other spiritual traditions and religious traditions. Like in so many other magic practices, having rituals around the new moon is a really core part of people's practice. And so the fact that this is so deeply embedded in Jewish tradition is just really cool to see those overlaps and how things so organically flow between different traditions and different forms of spirituality. I wanted to talk about the gendered aspect, and I feel like you had good resources, but I don't want to put you on the spot.
I can definitely talk about. I was just thinking while you were talking about this.
Yeah.
There's part of the Sefirot and part of Kabbalah is honoring Shekinah, or the kind of feminine parts of ourselves. And this is very specific that in some ways this has been co-opted and interpreted as just for women, but the actuality, it's laid out in the Zohar and it's laid out in Kabbalah, is that it is honoring the feminine within all of us, and it is not gendered, if that makes sense to everyone. So everybody can honor the feminine, and that's why I like to interpret Rosh Chodesh as honoring the feminine and the refusal in us. But with Shekinah specifically, there are different components of the Sefirot that honor the feminine, and Shekinah is, I believe, at the bottom. I won't get into the specific placement. But what's really cool is in the Zohar, there are moments, Shekinah and the feminine, it starts out as two spirits moving within one, or starts off male and then becomes female in the interpretation, in the physical manifestation. And so the Zohar was demonstrating that even in medieval Spain, there was a lot of play with gender and a lot of play with what is feminine and what is masculine. So I think it roots the Jewish tradition in more openness when it comes to gender, and specifically about what does it mean to honor our femininity and masculinity, rather than the way we think sometimes religion has always been very rigid around gender. That's all I was going to add to what you were already saying.
No, that was exactly what I was talking about. Yeah, just making it abundantly clear that although Rosh Chodesh is traditionally associated with women, it's important that we move away from that association, because genuinely it has space for people of all genders, and it really is just honoring this divine feminine. And the reason that happens with the new moon specifically, because the Rosh Chodesh is very specifically connected to the new moon, which is connected to the divine feminine, is just because the divine feminine is really couched in the energy of the moon. So the divine masculine is very couched in the energy of the sun, this very active, organized, maybe work-focused energy, but the divine feminine energy is very associated with the nighttime, intuition, really going with what feels right for you, play, creativity, expression of emotions. And so these things that sort of fall outside of what we're taught to engage with or taught makes us successful in our day-to-day lives. And so Rosh Chodesh is really a celebration of all of that energy that we don't get to celebrate day to day or during the daytime. And this is why it happens on the new moon, is the new moon and the coming of the moon is really emphasizing all of this energy. And so both of these have a place, of course, in our everyday experience. Neither one of these is more valuable than the other. Masculine and the divine masculine is equally as important as divine feminine energy. They're just different, and the way that we value them in society has shown up differently, of course, because of what we value and patriarchy and all of that fun stuff. But the point of Rosh Chodesh is this: we need that harmony between both of them, because an imbalance in this masculine and feminine energy doesn't bode well for us as individuals or us as a larger community. We need to be celebrating all of those parts. And there's also this very earth-based and nature-based value to the divine feminine and the holiday of Rosh Chodesh, which I think we see a lot in Judaism because, like Jesse was saying, Judaism so closely follows the moon cycle and the lunar calendar. And so in a lot of ways, that emphasis of underlying divine feminine energy throughout, because our holidays are going by the lunar calendar instead of just consistently by the sun. Did you want to add anything on divine feminine energy?
Yes, I wanted to add specifically about the Bina and being in contrast to the Chakma. So at the root of Kabbalah, there's the crown and God, that's the top one. And then the next two are Chakma and Bina. And Chakma is the kind of the moment you learn something or you acquire something and you're like, whoa, that's cool. And it lasts for a second. And you're in that wonder, and that's a very more traditionally masculine side of the Kabbalah. And then the Bina is the understanding, and when you start to parse it out and you start to contextualize and you get into it and you start thinking, okay, how am I interpreting this? What does this connect to other things I've learned? All of that analysis is really more of the feminine energy. So it's not about sexuality. It's not always childbirth. It's not always the way we think about feminine energy. It's really, when you get into it, it's all these little components that are parts of other processes that are ways you can honor the divine feminine.
Did you want to talk about Shemitah too?
Oh, yeah, quickly. This is also a special year within Judaism. It's a Shemitah year, and every 7 years within Judaism, as said in the Torah, it is a time of rest. And specifically, we are to rest the land, and we are to rest our social connections in some ways. In the times of Torah where there was slavery in the land, you are obligated to give your slaves a chance to go home, end their contract, leave. In the times of agriculture, you're designed to leave the fields completely to rest, to let them just overflow, let people take whatever they want, and debts are also forgiven. So we're just not going to worry about the debts you owe me this year. In a traditional sense, people have been arguing about how to honor that, in specifically, what do I do with my field? How do I let it rest? What do I do about bugs? That's not really where we're approaching it when we talk about how we're honoring it. We're thinking more about how to use the Rosh Chodeshes of this Jewish year to honor our divine feminine and also to honor the rest and to honor the process, stopping work and stopping that labor, whether it's emotional, physical, agricultural, and really thinking about how we are honoring ourselves.
Yeah, just a cool and fun addition to the fact that this year is a Shemitah year. And so thinking about honoring our divine feminine extra when we're focusing on celebrating Rosh Chodesh this year specifically, especially when we're, in the world of COVID and overworking and capitalism, I think it's extra important and powerful to take that day every month and reset ourselves. Something that I just wanted to mention around rituals for Rosh Chodesh, because how do we even celebrate Rosh Chodesh? And historically, that's less clear because women traditionally have been carriers of oral tradition and less written tradition. And so it's more about the ways that rituals have been passed down. And so there's not really anything like, this is how we celebrate Rosh Chodesh, but it can really be any form of coming together or individual practice, which I think is, again, what really ties it so much to other magic and spiritual practices, is this is how people ritualize the new moon in so many different practices. So that can be for someone who uses tarot in their practice, that can be doing a spread for the new moon or lighting specific ritual candles or just being with other people and doing something that's in celebration of the divine feminine, being really playful or painting pictures together, coloring, just really connecting with that part of ourselves is a celebration of Rosh Chodesh. So it doesn't have to be anything intentionally religious, but there also are chants and prayers that are associated with Rosh Chodesh as well that can ground it more in the religious aspects of Judaism. So yeah, just wanted to touch on that. And generally the centering of the moon and really thinking about living our lives more directly by the moon phases and the moon cycles, as opposed to this very consistent and structured energy that might be associated more with the divine masculine, and really encouraging people to rest and play and be creative and think about the ways that our spiritual practices overlap and can also connect to things that feel really good for us.
Just wondering if are there embodied practices for the new moon? Is there movement, maybe involved in the movement, and the play, creativity that does involve bodily movement, dance, play, creativity?
Yeah, again, I think because there's so few specifically written tradition, there's nothing that's this is how we're going to embody that. But I do think that embodiment around Rosh Chodesh specifically comes up a lot because the divine feminine presence is so associated with how we're embodying our emotions. And there's also a lot around menstrual cycles and how that is very specifically embodied for some people who identify as women. And so I think dance and movement is a really big part of Rosh Chodesh, but there's nothing specifically typed or written, if that makes sense.
I'm curious, maybe this is personal, but in your own lives, living in the work culture that we exist in, how do you practice? And maybe if you can offer even an anecdote of a conversation that this has invited. I'm speaking from my own personal experience of trying to center feminine ways of working and existing in the world, and just a lot of tension that comes up through confronting the patriarchy and those structures. So I'm just curious how that's been for you.
That is a really great question. Just this past Rosh Chodesh, my niece was born literally on Rosh Chodesh. It was the most exciting thing. I was like, this is amazing, the energy. So that was easy for me to be like, I'm not doing anything else other than just celebrating my niece. In general, I think it's very hard for us to divest from labor, even intellectually, when we choose to take the time off from work or when we choose to take time away. And I think that's been the harder process for me is I can say, yes, I'm taking Yom Kippur off, or yes, I'm taking Rosh Chodesh off, and then I'm sitting there like, well, if I just get on the computer for 3 minutes, I'll be fine. And then it's suddenly honoring that other part of me, which is necessary, and it is important to honor, like Alana was saying, aligned with the sun, the hard work, and there is a time for it. And I think what's harder for me is to really take the space to rest and to create and to play. So something that's big for me is I read a lot, and so I've taken to, instead of reading the next hard-hitting social justice book that I've been meaning to read and I'm saving all my time for it, I take a space to actually engage with some of the Jewish mysticism, and I've been trying to give myself some more. I was like, okay, you read that, now what are you going to do with it? Are you going to draw? Are you going to talk? Are you going to reach out to someone? And ground myself literally in the practice because it takes me out of kind of the work capitalist mindset personally.
Yeah, I really love that question a lot just because I think that for a long time, I thought that I had to separate my spiritual practices because I grew up religiously Jewish and was very much valued Judaism as my culture and my identity, but never really connected to it and more religious elements of Judaism. And my spirituality, as I started to explore it for myself, was very much grounded in rituals like reading tarot and working with crystals and different candle magic. And so realizing that that was actually connected to Jewish mysticism and just isn't the Judaism that I was taught about because it has more of these taboo elements was really cool and powerful to me to be like, oh, this actually already aligns perfectly and I can bring them together. And I think just for me, intentionally making space to practice some of those things on any holiday really, but especially Rosh Chodesh, just because in general it's connected to rituals, especially around the new moon rituals, but just learning to be okay also celebrating other holidays in what ways feel good for me, like on Yom Kippur, doing a spread for the new year or thinking about repentance through that instead of going and sitting in temple for the whole day, which for some people is really important in how they feel and practice their faith and spirituality, but understanding that I can apply my own lens and that can still be me practicing my Judaism. That's all we have for you on Rosh Chodesh and the Divine Feminine, and we hope that you all will really tune into the next new moon and maybe get together with some people and get creative or just do what feels good for you. And thank you for letting us into your beautiful space today.
Thank you so much.